Welcome to Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, the weekly podcast that features the very best in career development in the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Patton McDowell, and I want to help you become the kind of leader you want to be at your nonprofit organization. Thanks for listening. If you're new to the nonprofit sector, or maybe you want to be more effective in the role you're in now, you're in the right place. I'm glad to bring you these weekly conversations with nonprofit leaders who are on the cutting edge of our sector. And if you would, do me a favor, find that share button. Usually it's within the episode graphic on your device right now. Just find the three dots, click on it, and share this episode with one other person so we can continue to build a global community focused on nonprofit leadership. You know, I had a fantastic conversation in this episode with Keith Fishburne, who brings great experience as the president and CEO of Special Olympics North Carolina. And I bet you don't have many nonprofit colleagues out there who can say this. They've been at a single organization for 30 years, and most of their senior team have been there for 10 years or more. Well, Keith can in fact say all that. And it's even more remarkable in this era of turnover that plagues our nonprofit community. So how does he do it? Well, that's exactly what we talk about. And we discuss Keith's personal approaches to staying engaged at a single organization and how he has been successful in identifying, recruiting, and retaining a talented team of staff leaders. Don't forget to check out the show notes. This is episode number 129. Just go to the podcast page at patmcdowell.com. You can scroll through all of our episodes, or go to the news page on our website, again, patmcdowell.com, and you can see the full feature of Keith's episode, as well as find out more about Keith himself and the great work he's doing at Special Olympics North Carolina. Now, speaking of resources, while you're on our website, make sure you connect with us. Give us your email address so you can get free weekly episode resources just like this one, as well as other material we're putting together each and every week. Also, connect with us on our social media channels. We'd be happy to engage with you there. And also on the homepage, schedule some time with us. Happy to put a conversation on the calendar, talk about your nonprofit organization, or maybe your journey into nonprofit leadership. We've got a new cohort coming up in the spring of 22 for Leadership Gift School, as well as individual coaching, training, and a unique mastermind program that might be of interest to you. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Keith Fishburne. Keith, thank you for joining me on the path.
Great to be with you.
I'm excited about this conversation, Keith. You and I have known each other a long time, and you really have had an impressive run at Special Olympics North Carolina, and you've been, of course, active at the national and international level with that organization as well, which we can certainly talk about. But you know, what might be most impressive in an age of constant turnover, you've been with one nonprofit for 30 years. I wondered, what do you attribute that longevity and, you know, the ability to stay motivated for a single organization?
Oh, gosh. Well, thank you first for having me. And you know, working for an organization like Special Olympics is just, it's so rewarding in the sense that there's always something new and fresh to deal with. And you know, I have friends who work in certain jobs that, you know, they come home at the end of the day and they're just sick of everything. And that's just not that case, at least for us in Special Olympics. There's always something new and refreshing to do. There's a new initiative, and I'm happy to share about some of those with you as we talk today. But I think that's what's kept me in place. And you mentioned the interaction at the, you know, the national level and some at the international level. You know, we're unique within the Special Olympics family in that we can have an impact and a reach that far beyond just what I refer to as my playground, which is strictly North Carolina.
Yeah. So well put, Keith. And I, of course, had the privilege of working with you and with Special Olympics back in the day. I won't put a date on it as it puts both of us feeling a little bit older than we want to. But
That's
it,
right.
your point is well made. Special Olympics creates an energy, doesn't it, as an organization that is certainly benefits volunteers, the athletes, their families, and folks like you that work there. And I guess let me ask that question to you, Keith, because you could have gone any number of directions professionally. Why did you choose Special Olympics and nonprofit in general?
Well, as I went through high school and college, um, I was really involved in a lot of organizations that I think really I was trying to prepare myself for college in general, but taking on volunteer leadership roles within the community um, really exposed me to things that were going on in our community that needed addressing. And one of those things, even really before my college days, was that I had a friend who I didn't really understand at the time because I was too young, but he had muscular dystrophy. And so later on, as I got a little older, not quite to high school age, but I started helping to raise money for MDA. And I wanted to help my friend because I knew he was really the first friend and the first child I ever experienced in my life who had a disability. And so I think that really resonated with me as just a person and how I developed. And then as I got into college, I had the opportunity and was asked to direct a Parks and Recreation summer camp for people with intellectual disabilities. And so that introduced me to the world of people with intellectual disabilities and the things that they enjoyed at a summer day camp. It kind of took hold. I then went on to college and got a journalism degree at Carolina. And at the time when I came out of school, folks with journalism degrees weren't finding jobs. And so I really landed back in Parks and Recreation and back into service through work that I did with high school youth and youth development programs. And then I transitioned after a few years over to Special Olympics, working in public relations, and had the great chance to meet you and develop a friendship with you.
It's fantastic that you kind of took that experience literally as a young person, and literally, it seems to me it has kind of molded your career path all the way through, and that's impressive. And of course, you've been a fantastic ambassador for Special Olympics, and I would wager most of our listeners, Keith, certainly have heard the title of Special Olympics, but I bet many of them don't fully understand the organization. And I wonder if you could speak to that. What is Special Olympics, but maybe what are some of those things that people don't fully understand or appreciate?
Sure. And Special Olympics, just to put it simply, we're a sports organization for people with intellectual disabilities. And right now we're working with some 6 million individuals around the world. So we're truly a global sports organization. And we're one of the few organizations that the International Olympic Committee allows us to use Olympics in our name. So you've got the Olympic Committee, you've got the Paralympics, and then you've got Special Olympics. And we all work with different populations within our organizations. And so within Special Olympics, we work with folks with intellectual disabilities. But, there are a lot of misconceptions about us. A lot of people think about Special Olympics in its early days, which we were founded in the late 60s. And it was a once a year spring sports festival or spring games. And now it's just not that anymore. We're doing sports year round. At least not during pandemic times, we're not, but normally we would be doing sports year round. And a lot of people also confuse us with groups like the Paralympics, and we're very different in that degree. We do receive some government funding, but again, a lot of people think that Special Olympics is simply a part of the school system because that's where we have a lot of activity. But in reality, we're a privately funded 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we never ask the athletes to pay any fees to be a part of our organization. And so the money that we raise from foundations and from people and from businesses and special events and such help to fund what we do.
Keith, I knew you'd answer that well because it reminds me of, I think, a good lesson for nonprofit leaders to consider what are the frequently asked questions or the things that are most often misunderstood. And you are primed because, I guess you educate, the more people you educate, the more it helps the population you serve.
Sure, definitely.
Well, and let me ask you this. As you pondered in those early days joining Special Olympics, what were some of the questions you had, or what were some of the things that you learned quickly as you moved into a senior leadership role?
Yeah, when I came into Special Olympics, and I think we were a much smaller organization, and this was in the late 80s, early 90s, but we were poised for a great deal of growth. And we already had a very strong, school-based program. And I think we built on a lot of the work that needed to be done through Parks and Recreations and really developing partnerships throughout the state. And there was a great deal of investment in what we would refer to as field services. So building the staff to service the volunteers across the state. So, I think a lot of that played into, what kept us so busy and what kept me so interested, because with that came more responsibility than what I had originally been brought in to do, which was strictly public relations. And it really became, interesting to me because I began to see that this could be a career. When I came to Special Olympics, and actually, I remember you were on the interview committee that interviewed me. I really didn't think I would be in a job for more than a few years. I figured there'd be another path or another position that I would take somewhere else, and I would never have predicted to you that I would have gone on a career path to becoming a nonprofit CEO. And certainly I would not have predicted to you that I would still be here 31 years later.
That's remarkable. But again, speaks to, as you said earlier, the energy and the passion that I think Special Olympics brings to those affiliated with it. And in fact, for those, Keith, our listeners, not in North Carolina, elsewhere in the country or the world, talk about the size and scope of Special Olympics North Carolina.
Sure. I always like to say no matter where you live, there's probably a Special Olympics activity going on somewhere in your community or in a neighboring community, because we truly are global. In the United States, Special Olympics International has chosen to allow each of the states to have its own 501c3 status. And so there is a separate board of directors and a separate CEO for each state in the US. So to some degree, we operate autonomously from each other, but we also work in the same manner in that we're accredited by Special Olympics International. So we all have to follow the same policies and rules and carry out the program in the way that Eunice Kennedy Shriver had a vision for us to carry it out. And I've mentioned Special Olympics International. It's based in Washington, D.C. And then its work is to make sure Special Olympics exists in other countries around the world. And gosh, there's some 200 countries involved in Special Olympics. And the program accreditation status in that level is on a national basis. And so to some degree, the US states operate kind of like countries do for the global movement, if that makes sense. But the key component here is that we're working with people with intellectual disabilities, and we're really trying to improve their place in life, and we do this through sports. But we've taken on some new initiatives that really focuses on health and the wellness of the individual, so that they can do their best in sports.
Yeah, I'm glad you lifted that up, and I imagine you will again, that it's another aspect perhaps of Special Olympics. People don't realize that you are taking a holistic approach as an organization to these athletes that you serve. And in fact, here in North Carolina, Keith, talk about the size and scope of your team and your organization in this state.
Yeah, as far as a staffing perspective, we've got 30 staff who work for Special Olympics North Carolina. Most are based out of our headquarters, which is in the Raleigh area, and then we have staff, a good number of staff in the Charlotte area, and then some in the Greensboro area. But we're spread out enough to try to service the entire state. There's roughly almost 40,000 registered athletes involved in our program. And pre-pandemic numbers, we estimate there's about 20,000 people who volunteer with us each year. And that's putting on events throughout the year at the community level, whether they're putting on events or they're coaching our athletes. There's always some type of activity or touch that a person would have to help us manage Special Olympics in North Carolina.
Yeah, it's impressive. And again, I'm glad our listeners can kind of better understand the operation that is no small undertaking that you have to keep afloat, especially in the pandemic times, which we'll talk about in a bit. But let me talk about this, Keith. A lot of you and I both have friends in nonprofits that are part of chapter organizations, and you reference that. And surely there are advantages to being part of a well-known brand like Special Olympics. But are there challenges as well in terms of how you and your national or international office coexist?
Well, yes, there are. I think one of the things that we have to work carefully with is just how we go about our fundraising strategies, because in a non-pandemic year or a pre-pandemic time period, we're raising and spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 to $7 million a year on behalf of the athletes in North Carolina. And some of that money that gets raised is done through collaborative fundraising programs, which we are collaborating maybe with other states, or perhaps we're collaborating with our international office. And so the general public doesn't really differentiate. They just know that they're supporting Special Olympics. And so, it's certainly all of our jobs to make sure that we maximize the amount of money that we raise for our given program, whether it be North Carolina or another state or at the national level, so that we can get the best benefit on behalf of the athletes.
Yeah, I love the way you articulate that, because again, I've talked to individuals who struggle sometimes. You need to articulate the value, right, that SOI does bring to your organization, as I guess, Keith, you do as well to the individual programs across, in this case, North Carolina. And so that's another dynamic, because each of the county-based, in many cases, organizations, they have their own kind of independent operation to some extent. Is that right?
Yes, to some degree. I mean, the work that goes on at the community level still is under the umbrella of Special Olympics North Carolina. So we don't have separate 501c3s around the state doing things using the name Special Olympics. So when we refer to, say, Special Olympics Mecklenburg County or Special Olympics Polk County or whatever county name, that's just really the local organizing committee, and they are responsible for raising the funds that they need to spend on local initiatives on behalf of the athletes. And then we manage those finances for them so that they don't have to deal with that and deal with some of the administrative things that we deal with on an annual basis, such as audits and other financial reporting. But it also allows those local programs to really look at the strengths of their community to decide how they're going to run themselves. And I referred earlier to partnerships, and in some communities we're heavily based and operated through parks and recreation departments. In other communities, it may be very strong school-based programming. And then in some communities, we may have local programs or organizing committees that an individual person is just running it out of their home.
Right.
And so any one of these models can really work. It's just a matter of making sure that everybody understands how to implement Special Olympics in the correct manner.
Yeah, I love how you say that, and in essence, provide an infrastructure, don't you, at the state level, but you allow these local programs to adapt to their community strengths, and that, to me, is a hallmark of the organization.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, if you have listeners who are outside of North Carolina, Special Olympics may look a little differently on a local basis. But to some degree, we all ultimately are the same in that, we're trying to empower the volunteers at the local level to carry out what they're doing. So in other words, in another state, you may have multiple sets of counties that exist in that local program setting. Whereas in North Carolina, and I think in Florida, it comes off the top of my head, we operate on a county by county basis.
Gotcha. Well, again, it's a good illustration of the complexity of the organization you manage. So I want to call attention to Special Olympics North Carolina as a result of this conversation, this episode. But I think it helps listeners who are pondering their own nonprofit leadership, kind of how these things can best be managed. And you mentioned it, Keith, back to your journey starting. You arrived on what was in essence a fast-moving and fast-growing organization. Do you recall in those early days, were there any other kind of challenges you faced, and what helped you become successful, what now, approaches 3 decades?
Yeah. Well, when I took over as the CEO, our previous CEO took a position with Special Olympics International, and we also were I think a little bit more than 2 years out from hosting the Special Olympics World Games here in the Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill area, which for our organization, it's the single largest event we host ever in a year's time. Some 7,000 athletes from a couple of hundred countries come into your community for nearly 2 weeks of activities and competition. And so it's a huge undertaking, and there's a whole separate staff and management effort that puts on those World Games separate from the host program. And in my sense, Special Olympics North Carolina being the host program. So, not only was I learning the ropes of being in my, at the time, early 30s and learning how to be a nonprofit CEO, but I had this huge event coming into my state that I shared a name with. And that name obviously is Special Olympics. And so the real challenge there was to make sure, you talk about collaboration and partnerships. I had to make sure I could work well with the management and the leadership of the World Games. And I did. The CEO of the 99 World Games became a great friend, and he understood the dynamic of how Special Olympics North Carolina didn't want to lose its identity while these World Games were here. And so, the result of that was that we just had this tremendous amount of exposure for Special Olympics after the World Games concluded in July of 1999. And we saw tremendous growth in terms of athlete registration, volunteer registration, funding. So it really, in some sense, what was a challenge to me, as a new CEO, became a real benefit and some legacy pieces that I was able to take and build on.
You took advantage of an opportunity, though, didn't you, Keith? That you're right. It could have overwhelmed the state level organization, but you partnered successfully, and that, you rode that for 5 to 10 years, maybe, right? In terms of all the benefits that accrued. Yeah,
we did, and I think when the board decided to ask me to step into the CEO role, and when they did, there was some concern that if they brought in someone who didn't understand Special Olympics and didn't understand Special Olympics North Carolina, that there might have been a bigger risk than having someone like me that had been on staff for a good 8 years and kind of knew what was going on in terms of our own growth in North Carolina.
Makes total sense. And something else that we alluded to in the opening was you've been very proactive in staying involved, getting involved at the national and international level. And of course, you don't have to, right? I guess many of your colleagues can stay very busy at the state level or country level. What has motivated you to get involved on the national, international level? And I'm guessing that has benefits back to your North Carolina organization.
It does, and it's a tremendous professional development opportunity, because I'm getting to interact with my colleagues, fellow CEOs, of programs that are larger than mine, same size as mine, smaller than mine, and we deal with issues and topics strictly to make Special Olympics a better organization for the athletes. And so it's been a real rewarding chance to take on leadership roles that essentially, you're right. I mean, we become volunteers leading these U.S. committees or these North America regional committees. But it also benefits us when we come back home, because we've been a part of perhaps some of the strategic planning or the helping to develop the tactics or whatever the case may be, for not only the region or the country, but for our own state as well.
Yeah, I've always been impressed with what appeared to me, Keith, to be your intentional networking at the national, international level. And I'm thinking, as a takeaway for our listeners, that are there opportunities to engage at a level beyond your organization? And I think sometimes nonprofit leaders are reticent to do that, but I guess wondering if you had found, now I'm sure it adds to your plate when you sign up to lead a committee or to be involved in a games like that. But I guess in the long run, you feel like that has been a benefit to you and to your program.
I do. I feel like, you develop resources, and quite frankly, sometimes people move around, and when I have staff openings, if I've gotten to know staff in other states that maybe they're ready for a career change and they want to come to a little bit larger program, it's a great opportunity for me to kind of know who's out there around the country working in the same Special Olympics organization. So I have a couple of people on staff who I've hired from other state programs, and it's been a step up in their career journey themselves to come to work at a program our size.
That's a fantastic point. In fact, we'll talk about, I know you and I have kind of 5 keys that we'll talk about in terms of your nonprofit leadership, but that whole quest for talent. And so many, Keith, right, nonprofit leaders struggle to attract, identify, and retain talent. And so it sounds like that is also a benefit to your, in essence, national networking.
It has been. And the other thing I'll point out is just, interns that have been with us or interns that have worked in other states. It's a great training ground, because I can tell you, if I look at a resume for a position I have open and I've noticed that an intern has done some things in another state, I'll give that resume a harder look.
You'll highlight that. Well, that's a good commercial to those listeners, perhaps earlier in their careers, that internships do in fact lead to jobs, right? And not you're confirming that for sure. All right. Well, Keith, before we get into the big 5, I'm gonna get into your head. As a man with a ton of things going on, and you have, of course, historically, how do you stay organized? No right or wrong answer, of course, but I'm just curious, how do you manage the volume of activity? Have you found, in your leadership journey, things that have helped you stay on top of all of it?
Well, I would have to say that first and foremost, the people that are my direct reports have got to be people that I can trust and rely on, and not certainly take up a lot of my time, because I've got to supervise them. So, when I'm able to delegate to them and allow them to do their jobs, and then when we have our periodic update meetings, simply, really hit the high points of what kinds of things are challenges, and then certainly what I always like to talk about the successes. But That's what's crucial to me, because if I find myself having to do their jobs, then I've not done myself any good, and I've not done them any good. So certainly there are things that I have to do in my role as the CEO, and so those are the things that will keep me busy. But truly understanding and believing in delegation is something that I would say keeps me focused, and it helps me stay organized.
Are you a to-do list guy? That you use technology? Because your point is well made. Organization starts with the people around you too, right? Having that maximize your team. But for you personally, how do you literally keep up with the day-to-day tactical activity?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there's always a to-do list sitting around. Sometimes it's on the computer, and sometimes it's on a sheet of paper that I carry around. But the main thing, we laugh about this, and it's pretty common sense. And when you get to the point where we are in our careers, you just got to write things down.
Yep.
There's so many people that I deal with, both in the for-profit sector and nonprofit sector, who they'll have a whole meeting and they won't write a thing down, and there's just no way they remember the outcomes of those meetings when they're sitting there. And it sometimes it worries me when I come out of a meeting and I've noticed nobody's taken any notes, or was this really a successful meeting? And I know I stress to my staff, don't show up without your laptop or your pen and paper for any meetings.
Well put. And yeah, I'm glad to hear and reassured that you and I both share what I'd call a hybrid method. We still need the pen and paper. We're trying to use technology where it makes sense, but when in doubt, pull out the notepad, right, and write it down.
That's right.
Keith, Special Olympics, in essence, its mission is based on inclusion, obviously for a population that historically has been left out. And so Special Olympics, and you in particular, have been champions for diversity, equity, inclusion. What's going on that front in the Special Olympics world?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's been a lot of I think improvement by Special Olympics, particularly over the past year or so. Our international office, through some studies and research that they spent a good 5 or more years doing, has come back to us at the state level, at least, and ask us to look at some information that perhaps we weren't collecting, and to look at policies and vision statements that perhaps didn't exist within our organizations. And so the DE&I task force that I sit on for the United States really is trying to take this on, not everything at once, but we're trying to help the states come up with policy statements and vision tactics to address some of the information that Special Olympics International would like us to track. And to get specific for you, we want to know the demographics of our athletes, of our volunteers, and certainly of our staffs, because we want to know that Special Olympics looks like the communities where we all live and exist.
Yep.
And I can say here in North Carolina, for the most part, we do, but there are areas that we could improve on. And so that's been my commitment through our own DE&I work, is to take a look at some of our key leadership roles. And if we don't feel like that diversity exists in a positive way, then we've got to figure out how to make that happen.
Yeah, and that's such a tough question, isn't it? Keith, I had Jim Taylor from Board Source, who specializes in the diversity challenge, because many nonprofits boards are largely male and white, and many of the staff structures of nonprofit organizations across the board are struggling, and even with good intentions, trying to create more diversity. But has it led to some kind of tactical activities that you have seen maybe across the country as organizations try to diversify? I guess we can stay with the staff and board side for this part.
Yeah, I would have to say that we're at the beginning stages. I know for us in North Carolina, our board already is a fairly diverse board in terms of the gender makeup, the race makeup, and our staff could be better in terms of our numbers. We are a heavily female-dominated staff, and in terms of people of color, there's 2 out of 30. So again, we could show some improvement,
Sure.
and I think most of the states would say the same thing. That's an area that we need to have better relationships. One of the things that we emphasize here in North Carolina are our internship programs with colleges and universities across the state. And I think it's been real important over the past couple of years that we've focused more attention on HBCUs. And our newest developing relationship is Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte,
right?
Which is going to help our work that for some special funding that we're getting in what's called our Unified Champion City Schools program, that we're going to be really concentrating on those Title I schools in the Mecklenburg County school system to improve the Special Olympics offerings amongst those students, and to get the general education population involved in Special Olympics. So there are a lot of strategies like that when you begin to interact with interns, you're going to expose them to your organization so that if future jobs come open, you've got a more diverse pool of people to talk to when you go through the interview process.
Yeah, you nailed it, Keith. In fact, you anticipated what I was going to ask you about, because I knew you had done great work on the internship side, and it was what Jim Taylor, in fact, recommended. It's one thing to talk about diversity, but strategically aligning with partners like you have with Johnson C. Smith and other institutions across the state. He said the same thing. Connecting with alumni associations of those same HBCUs might, again, create volunteer opportunities. And of course, it just exposes your organization to folks that likely would get involved. And so kudos to you for kind of getting that in motion. And I know that will affect, you're building, in essence, a talent pool, right, that hopefully will allow you to hire as well.
Yeah. And I think as we go along, we're going to develop other relationships. I know that there are chambers of commerce that are working hard on this same topic, and I would see that right now we're not really partnering with any of them, but I would say that there's probably a place there that we could go and enlist their support and their help as well.
Yeah, good ideas. And again, I'm hoping you and I both will get our listeners' wheels turning about what kind of activity they can engage in to be better in this whole DEI concept. You talked about the kind of staffing model, which I think was fascinating in terms of the type of people you like to surround yourself. They do need to be independent and the ability to do their jobs without kind of taking more of your time. That's why you hire them. But let's talk about the board. For 25 years, Keith, you've had to work with very passionate and talented volunteer board members. I hear a lot of times from our nonprofit friends, sometimes their board is either disengaged or they're driving them crazy because they're micromanaging. So talk about how you have kind of managed that board CEO relationship.
Yeah, I think it starts with the key leadership of the board. And I've been fortunate through my tenure that the key people that have risen to leadership positions in our board have a true understanding of their roles as nonprofit leaders. And but I think that also it goes along with the fact that they are also leaders in and of themselves, perhaps with other nonprofits. And so they come to appreciate that they really don't have time to micromanage any of the nonprofits they're involved with. Many of them are also very engaged in their own business or their own professions. And so, I'll knock on wood as I say this. I feel fortunate that I've over the years had great boards of directors, and that they've been supportive. Everybody's known, what's the phrase? Their place in the lane.
Right.
And that's not to say there's not a hiccup here and there, but for the most part, I think it's the recruitment of board members is something that you work closely with your board, and obviously the CEO can have a role in identifying potential board members to essentially bring the right mix of people to the table to serve on whatever kind of board you want to have. And with us, we have a board of business owners. We have special athletes on our board. We have family members of our athletes on our board. We have a real good mix of people in terms of their work experience and their backgrounds and such. So, it brings a lot of good perspectives to the table when we have topics and policies and such that we need to deal with.
I'm impressed again, because I can tell you've been intentional with the diversity of your board membership. I take it as that kind of a specific analysis you do on an annual basis. Do we have the right people who represent all of the different constituencies that are affiliated with Special Olympics?
Yeah, it is something we look at, and it's something that essentially our executive committee will look at as we go forward and recruit board members, because again, it can be real easy, as you mentioned earlier, to suddenly start bringing on a lot of the same types of people, and so you have to kind of slow yourself down and say, well, do we need another person from this part of the state, or do we need another person in this profession, because we've got so many already on our board. So
right.
You really have to analyze it that way, so that you don't become heavy in one area of board membership.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And clearly you've done it for a long time. So you've created a self-perpetuating system, it seems, to build talent. And I'm guessing that kind of sets the bar high enough that when new people join the board, you've created kind of a level of excellence that fortunately maintains itself.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. I think, something that we're going to be working on in general in Special Olympics is just what our onboarding process is.
Right.
We've got the benefit of technology that we've all learned more about webinars and having technology close by to essentially do some onboarding using technology. Whereas, a lot of times in the nonprofit sector, we feel like we have to do all of our onboarding, through meetings and orientations and in-person ways. But we're really, and this is an initiative that our North American region office is leading with us. So I'm excited that that's going to be a better process. And I think board members and staff who come in the future are going to be educated more quickly because of this new process that we're going to create.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, they'll hit the ground running, won't they? Or even faster as a result of that type of onboarding, because I've seen too many organizations, frankly, that don't do it. And the saddest story I hear from a dedicated board member is like, yeah, Pat, and it took me a year to kind of figure out what was going on. And so I guess, Keith, that's what you all are, not that it was taking people a year, but in essence, I guess there was some recognition that we need board members to more quickly and fully acclimate to their role.
Yeah, I think so. And, it's interesting you mentioned that, because sometimes when we bring board members on who maybe have had absolutely no experience with Special Olympics, those are the types of people that it does take them a little bit longer to figure things out. They may be familiar with, reading financial statements and doing some of the governance and fiduciary things that most organizations have in common. But when it comes to the actual mission and why we operate the way we do. For new people, it can take a little longer.
And this process will obviously help, I guess, adapt to board members where they are, right? And make all of them more successful and comfortable. Speaking of something that's not always comfortable for nonprofit leaders is fundraising. And Keith, you've had to do a lot of that. And I wonder how do you approach it? In other words, as a CEO, you have talent on your team that does a lot of the activity for fund development, but is there a certain threshold of donor that you're like, as the CEO, I need to interact with a certain donor? How do you approach fundraising from your chair?
Well, again, I'll answer your question by first saying I'm going to knock on wood because I don't want to jinx myself. But my fundraising staff, three of my key fundraising staff have been with me more than a decade. And quite honestly, in the nonprofit sector, as you well know, that's just unheard of. So between my own tenure and the fact that I've got three key development staff that have 10 plus years doing their jobs, that continuity, that consistency has really brought a lot of success to us. It lends a lot in terms of relationship building, and so we're fortunate in that sense. We certainly raise money using every means possible. We work with people, individuals, to ask for donations. We work with foundations. We put on signature special event fundraisers. Obviously, we look at corporations and businesses for support. So nothing goes untapped. We simply have to look at it from what's the best strategy to get a person or a company or a foundation engaged with us. And a good example that I'll share if I've got some time left is,
sure.
When we engaged in more programming in the health and wellness field, where we were developing relationships with people with medical backgrounds to do some non-invasive medical exams of our athletes at events, and then also provide some follow-up recommendations to athletes that maybe we discovered needed some follow-up healthcare because of something like poor eyesight or bad hearing or high blood pressure. We also at that time began to discover that there were funders out there who were interested in the fact that we were doing this now.
Right.
Because from your earlier question of people misunderstanding or not fully knowing what Special Olympics is all about, most people don't understand that we've got this new initiative in health that is really robust. And it's so robust for us here in North Carolina. We have a full-time health director on staff now who has a background in public health. It's not just somebody who we said, hey, you're going to be the health and wellness person. We went out and found someone who is properly educated in that field to carry out our strategies and all our tactics in that area. But it also gave our grant writer a whole new ability to apply for funds that have been helpful in our success in that area.
It's a great example. And that, again, how you've leveraged your team and the longevity of your team. In fact, I have to circle back to this, Keith. I can't think of 5 of my best fundraising friends that have been at their job for 10 years. Can't even name 5.
Yeah.
You've retained an entire team for a decade. How do you do that?
Well, it's got more to do with our mission, I think, than me, to be perfectly honest with you.
I know you'd be modest about that. Yes.
When you come into an organization like Special Olympics and you see the good that you can do in improving the lives of people with intellectual disabilities, that motivates. And one of my lead fundraisers, she came to the organization on the program side. She was here to do program related work. She did not come to me as a fundraiser.
Right.
And she showed some interest and potential in fundraising. And she will laugh with you if she hears this story, because I nudged her pretty hard to take the knowledge that she had gained working on the program side of Special Olympics and put the same passion into her fundraising work. And she's been phenomenal. And so to some degree, and as you well know, sometimes people that go into fundraising have studied it and trained in it and have risen through the ranks. And then other people come to it because they were great as programmers, and then they become great asking for money.
Great point. Glad you lifted it up, because yes, I share some of that story. And I wonder if it's good advice for our listeners to think about, do they have fundraising talent within their organization, perhaps on the program side? Who better to articulate the value of the program and the interaction that they've had with the folks they serve? Because I did indeed start at Special Olympics on the program side and then tried to become a fundraiser after that. But I'm glad you not only demonstrate kind of how you've retained your talent, but also you were very effective in identifying talent that maybe not would not have come through the traditional fundraising track.
Well, I think if there are, nonprofit execs who are listening that are struggling with maintaining their fundraising staff, it's one strategy you could think about is moving someone from that mission or program side over. But you've got to do it in a way that both of you agree to it, and it's not something that could be threatening to the individual that would become the potential fundraiser.
Yeah, good point. And so not necessarily one size fits all, but I do think it's a creative use of your talent and your kind of exploration of talent within your organization to think about where people might develop. Because I think that's another reason, Keith, a lot of people leave. They don't feel like they have a path forward. And it seems to me you illustrated to folks throughout your organization that there may be opportunities within or maybe outside of their current department, if you will.
Yeah, I think so. And it's certainly your organization, no matter how big or small you are, your people can only go so far at a certain given time, especially if you're not having a lot of turnover. And one of the things I do like to stress to our folks is, as a organization that is not just focused on North Carolina, at other Special Olympics programs around the country.
Well, Keith, let me move to our last question before we close, in terms of, you started this kind of conversation with how the energy, the mission of Special Olympics brought you in. And now 30 years later, you still seem to have that energy. And I guess I want to ask you that, how do you continue to create professional development for yourself? I guess the organization keeps throwing new things at you and that keeps you engaged, or how do you kind of personally motivate to keep going and get better?
Yeah, for me, Special Olympics has filled that role. I mean, I have certainly participated with non-Special Olympics professional development opportunities, and I do get a lot out of that. I've served on a few other organization, I wouldn't call them boards, but maybe advisory groups, that's gotten me away from the Special Olympics world, which has always been helpful to me. But one of the really important things to me is the interactions I have with my fellow CEOs of Special Olympics programs around the country.
Yep.
And I know that perhaps a lot of nonprofits don't have the benefit of that, but if you are a part of a nonprofit, that has sister chapters, getting to know your counterparts in other parts of the country, I think is as important as anything when it comes to professional growth and just sharing best practices, sharing challenges, because there's nobody else really. I mean, I've got my staff that all report to me. I've got the board and I report to the board. So if I want to, really talk shop with somebody and share a challenge, I might want to call a fellow CEO than maybe talking to a board member or a staff member. It just gives you I'm not saying that I don't talk to those folks. I'm just saying that it gives you a different perspective from somebody that isn't there experiencing the day-to-day things, perhaps that you are, or the people that you work day-to-day with are.
Such a good point, Keith. And you have maintained kind of strategic networking, it seems to me, throughout your career, and that has benefited you and the organization in many ways. So great advice throughout this conversation. And again, grateful for your time and thoughts on this. Is there anything else, Keith, if someone approached you about, hey, I'm thinking about getting into nonprofit leadership, any other advice you might offer them?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the one thing I would advise people is to, try to make sure you're looking at positions that you can come to the table with some qualifications and experience. And I think that's really important because, so many times when I look at resumes, people are applying for positions that I have that the two don't match. And,
right.
My general advice is if you're going to break into the nonprofit sector, you do have to unfortunately spend some time, maybe volunteering or doing some things to build your resume so that you're appropriate for the jobs that you're wanting to seek.
Great advice. And you're right. You and I both have seen well-intentioned applicants, but they may not fully understand or appreciate what they're getting into. And so this is a profession that we are in the nonprofit world, and we need people to take that seriously. So I'm glad you're reminding us of that. Keith, if I can ask one more gift from you through this conversation. As you know, I ask every guest to share a book that's been meaningful to you, or perhaps you would recommend to someone on this nonprofit journey.
Yeah, the book is called Uncharitable, and it's subtitled How Restraints on Nonprofits Undermine Their Potential. And it's a great read in that it presents some different thoughts on the way society in general looks and thinks about the nonprofit sector. It addresses issues of compensation and the fact that so many people consider the people being paid to do nonprofit work, what in the world is all that about? And quite frankly, the nonprofit sector now is filling a role that is unprecedented in our country's history. And the book also addresses, other myths and misunderstandings about whether or not nonprofits should use advertising to help improve fundraising opportunities. It addresses the whole concept of what people think of the word overhead means in the management of the fiduciary aspect of the organization. So, if you're familiar with the nonprofit sector and the nonprofit world, and even if you're not, it's just a good read to kind of educate you about another way to think about managing and running the nonprofit sector.
Fantastic choice, Keith. On my bookshelf, I'm delighted to lift it up with you. I think it's Dan Pallotta that wrote that among a couple of books, right? And you're right. It's thought-provoking and a great read for folks in nonprofit leadership or thinking about it. And so I appreciate you lifting it up. Keith, got lots of good information to put in the show notes for this episode. Where can people find out more about you and the great work you're doing through Special Olympics North Carolina?
Yeah, well, I'm on LinkedIn. You're certainly welcome to check that out. And certainly visit our website, see all the great things that we're doing here in North Carolina.
Fantastic. We will indeed link all this together. And I encourage our listeners to learn more about Special Olympics North Carolina or Special Olympics wherever you are, because as Keith shared with us, it is truly a global movement and an organization you ought to check out. So Keith, thank you again for joining me on the path.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the time.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Keith as much as I did and came away with some practical ideas that can maybe enhance your organization's talent strategy and perhaps your own job satisfaction in the nonprofit sector as well. Don't forget about the show notes. This is episode number 129. Just go to our website, pattonmcdowell.com, and you can find out more about Keith, Special Olympics North Carolina, and in fact, a link to the Special Olympics International website where you can find a program that's closest to you. As always, please share this episode with someone else on the path. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe. Just go to that podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com and you'll see the follow button that'll link you to any of the primary podcast platforms. Don't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. They come out every Thursday, as well as bonus features we're producing every month. Thanks for all you're doing in the nonprofit sector, especially right now, and keep up the good work for causes that are most meaningful to you. I'll keep bringing you content that can help you do it even better. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time on The Path.